Okay, well, good evening, everybody. My name is Bob O'Keefe. I'm one of the vice principals here at Royal Holloway, University of London, and I'm also Dean of the Faculty of Management, Economics and Law. It is my pleasure tonight to introduce the inaugural lecture of Fiona Moore. Fiona is Professor of Business Anthropology here at Royal Holloway, University of London. She received a doctorate from Oxford University in 2002, where she completed a thesis on ethnic identity among German expatriate bankers in the City of London. Her subsequent research on identity and culture in German multinational corporations, chiefly BMW UK, has been published in the Journal of International Business Studies and other leading journals. She's written a monograph entitled Transnational Business Cultures on German expatriates in the City of London, with a second monograph due to be published this year on Taiwanese elite labour migrants in London and Toronto. Her current research focuses on the development of international knowledge networks by Taiwanese professionals in the UK and Canada. Fiona, as some of you will know, also reviews and writes science fiction for a number of publications. Her previous credits include fiction and poetry in Interzone, Asimov, Dark Horizons, and On Spec. I know this because I went and looked at some of it, and I actually spent enjoyed reading this evening, reading one of the stories called The Confession of Whistling Dixie, which is an intriguing title and very enjoyable. She's also written 2 stage plays, 4 audio plays, 4 guidebooks, cult TV series. Notably a recent 2-volume guide to Battlestar Galactica, which runs to nearly 700 pages. Available later again. So, hugely interesting individual with wonderful research, and it's a great pleasure to introduce her in the inaugural lecture. Yeah.
Hello, and thank you all for coming. Can everybody hear me? Yes, thanks. So I'll begin. While social and cultural anthropology remain somewhat on the fringes of international business, or IB, studies, they have nonetheless been a presence in it since the founding of the discipline, contributing tacitly to the development of cross-cultural management studies in particular, and more recently being instrumental in the critique of simplified models of culture, both within and outside organizations, which have pervaded the discipline since the 1980s, a critique which is increasingly gaining strength as researchers and practitioners find earlier models less and less useful. However, anthropology can contribute much more than this in terms of providing ways of studying and understanding the complex patterns of thinking and the external and internal influences which underlie multinational corporations. Even more than this, however, anthropology provides new analytical approaches which can allow researchers studying multinational corporations to acknowledge, even make use of, their own subjective relationships to the companies that they study, and provide ways of usefully incorporating knowledge from other disciplines in ways that strengthen IB itself. The title of this lecture first deserves some contextualization. And the slides do too. In the Ethnography and Industrial Praxis Conference, there's a tradition of doing a form of lecture called a pechakucha, which means doing a lecture with accompanied by slides with no words, just pictures, and talking to the pictures. So as well as introducing people to anthropology and business, tonight I also propose to introduce the pechakucha to the School of Management. Returning to the title, my background is not in business and management studies, as Bob's indicated, but in social anthropology, and most of my references are still drawn from this area. The title of this talk refers to a volume by anthropologist Nigel Barley, like myself, a product of Oxford's Institute for Social and Cultural Anthropology, whose work, The Innocent Anthropologist, Notes from a Mud Hut, is an account of his ethnographic fieldwork with the Dawayo people of the Cameroon. Ethnographic fieldwork is the defining methodological trait of anthropology and involves researchers spending long periods living with, observing, and participating in the life of a particular group. Barley's monograph, published in 1983, broke with then usual anthropological practice of minimizing the researcher's presence in the narrative and of presenting the group under study in a fairly decontextualized fashion, and instead describes his own adventures in painfully specific detail, whilst also situating these in a wider context of political corruption, well-meaning but often misguided international aid programs, a challenging physical environment, and, by implication, conflicting discourses over the place of Cameroon, its tribal people, and their place in a globalizing world. Hence the image on the front of the book. His choice of the phrase of mud hut, in particular, is of note, as it sends up the image of the anthropologist as someone working among primitive, uncivilized people, and yet not challenging the colonialist assumptions behind this image. In doing so, Barley followed the spirit of the anthropologist's mandate to, as we say, make the strange familiar and the familiar strange, by forcing the anthropological academic community to consider their own myths and traditions, and forms part of a tradition of critique and self-reflection which extends back to the formation of the discipline in its present form in the 1910s and 1920s. Although my own work has been somewhat less controversial than Barley's, I've never actually been banned from entering a country, Barley is still banned from entering the Cameroon, apparently. The title has relevance to the present lecture in that my own work is also situated first and foremost in this postmodern tradition of anthropological self-critique, and secondarily has crossed over to become what is part of possibly the first critical movement in international business studies, bringing the techniques of studying the mud hut into the boardroom. I will now discuss what this has meant in anthropology and IB. So, before I begin discussing anthropology's role in business, I would like to provide a brief historical overview of the discipline. Gary Larson himself, the cartoonist, actually studied anthropology, hence some of his repeated references to anthropology and its traditions. Social anthropology began in the 19th and early 20th centuries as a supposedly objective science based in what was known as functionalism. The aim of this particular take on social anthropology was to understand human behavior through observing and participating in social activities, and, through comparison, attempting to categorize and typologize human activity. This gave way, in the 1950s and 1960s, to a revolt in anthropology from linguists and structuralists, who argued that anthropology could never be an objective science because it is impossible to separate the observer and the analyst from the activity being observed or analyzed. The structuralist movement took the position of analogizing culture to language, that there exist universal deep structures underlying human cultures, which are, nonetheless, hugely diverse within the rules generated from these deep structures, necessitating a complex comparative understanding which acknowledges that some human activities are universal, but the way in which these activities play out vary widely from context to context. As a consequence from this linguistic, subjective approach, anthropology underwent a transition from the sciences to the humanities, which business anthropologist Malcolm Chapman describes as a shift from function to meaning, saying, once language and systems of meaning were under consideration, the confident objectivity also necessarily foundered. The study of meaning requires, beyond any argument, close attention to the point of view of the social actors. Chapman argues that meaning becomes inescapable also through the field's focus on ethnographic methodology. In order to properly study any group, an anthropologist must become a holistic student, studying language, religion, and other aspects of society, and, as much as is possible, living with and participating in the culture in question, more on which later in this talk. The shift from function to meaning was further elaborated by the post-structuralist movement, which regarded the study of structures underlying society as one which was itself subject to observer bias and cultural prejudice, and focused instead on the production of knowledge within societies, and postmodernism, which further questioned the idea that one can separate the observer from the observed. Ethnographies of business arguably date back to the Mayo studies of the 1920s, and certainly gained acceptance within anthropology through the factory studies of the 1940s and 1950s. As with traditional anthropology, however, these studies tended to focus on laborers, migrant groups, and other elite, non-elite aspects of business. The first ethnographies of multinational corporations, which are normally identified, are Nash and Rollin, both in 1979, although Nash herself notes a few pioneering studies in the late 1960s and early to mid-1970s. Administrative Science Quarterly's two special issues on the anthropology of business in 1979 and 1983 also marked the emergence of the business anthropology genre. That it should emerge in the late 1970s is perhaps not surprising, since the discipline of IB and sub-discipline of cross-cultural management really begin to appear around this time. The 1970s also marks the point at which a movement began to gain strength in anthropology aimed at criticizing the discipline's links with colonialism in the past and arguing that its focus on so-called primitive societies, more politely, small groups, tribes, peasant villages, and so forth, furthers colonialist narratives. The same period also, for instance, saw a rise in urban anthropology and in studies of minority groups within American and European societies, and it is also this period that gave rise to the ethnography that gave its title to this talk. The 1990s, however, saw this strand of anthropology merging with another, the study of migration, as part of the anthropology of transnationalism. Transnational studies thus challenged anthropological paradigms by studying people in multiple sites and in virtual places, including European and North American cities, engaged in macroeconomic processes and questioning the reality of paradigms which distinguish transnationalism from above and that from below. This included a subfield focused on business and transnationalism, from migrant laborers through to expatriates and CEOs, typified by such studies as Leslie Sklair's seminal, controversial, and rather prophetic monograph, The Transnational Capitalist Class, describing what these days is more colloquially known as the 1%, or Jonathan V. Beaverstock's study of British expatriates in Singapore. I entered anthropology, therefore, at a time when there was much academic interest in taking the knowledge gained from the study of people living in mud huts and applying it to people working in Deutsche Bank, and this, indeed, formed the basis of my doctoral research, an analysis of how German bankers in the City of London use their ethnic identities to maintain social cohesion in their transnational lifestyle. I will now consider how this activity has contributed to our understanding of culture and international business. The most immediate way in which anthropology has had an impact on the study of international business has been the recent upheaval over the way in which culture, so-called, is treated in cross-cultural management studies. Historically, in IB, culture is conceived as, firstly, operating primarily, if not exclusively, on the national level. Secondly, as a kind of programming which exists independently of class, religion, minority status, and other aspects, and which is generally a fixed and definite property. 3, behavior-focused. And 4, quantifiable through surveys and equations. This development occurred because, while cross-cultural management studies came from a similar starting point to anthropology, studying a particular phenomenon with a view to better understanding human culture, in this case with the very practical aim of helping businesses to understand and overcome the limitations presented by cultural differences, it ultimately was more influenced by the behaviorist and positivist side of the social sciences. The best-known manifestation of this is, of course, Hofstede's Culture's Consequences and its various sequels, revised editions, and derivations, which was based on a global-scale study involving administering questionnaires to the employees of a single multinational corporation, and through tallying and comparing their scores, indicating that there were, indeed, differences between cultures which could affect businesses and which could to some extent be empirically measured. As Chapman argues, the problem is less the study itself so much as the fact that, quotes, too much research takes Hofstede's dimensions and index scores as if they were a positively and finely established feature from which other research could grow. It might be better to regard Hofstede's findings as highly provisional and open to criticism on all the intellectual fronts that can be opened between questionnaire-based psychology and ethnographically based social anthropology. The map on the slide is to indicate that there are certain features of biology, culture, and so forth, which either transcend national borders or operate within national borders. And again, that it can be a little difficult to separate both of these. If you look at the frequency of red hair, for instance, you'll notice it follows a particular pattern which is not entirely incongruent with the activities of the Vikings in the early medieval period. There are a variety of other cultural factors influencing the selection towards red hair as well. This is obviously a subject in which I take a certain amount of personal interest. While Hofstede and similar dimension-based studies continue to be prominent in IB, and while nobody has yet written a monograph on the influence of red hair on cross-cultural management, I think there may be one on Vikings and management style out there, though. Their impact appears to have lessened in recent years. The initial developments came through critiques by, among others, Brendan McSweeney, indicating that the surveys were reductive, obscuring the effects of class, education, historical context, regional and local factors, and so forth, hair color, whatever. Anthropological research on multinational corporations contributed to this critique. Brannan and Salk, for instance, arguing that culture should be viewed not as a fixed property, but as a negotiated discourse, or studies such as Diana Sharp's work on Japanese multinationals, showing that managers of different national origins are engaged in complex micropolitics in which the role of culture is far from predictable or indeed discernible. To provide an example from my own recent research on the problems which a reductive approach to culture can generate, consider the case of Taiwan. Anthropological and historical studies of Taiwan indicate a country with a complex and contested identity, with an obvious social divide between the Wai Shengran, families who migrated to the island following the communist victory on the mainland, and the Ban Shengran, families who date from the earlier period of Chinese colonization between the 17th and 20th centuries, and also other more complicated divisions involving Chinese minorities, Aboriginal peoples, the colonization period, the Dutch and Spanish in the early to mid-17th century, and so forth. My own study of Taiwanese elite migrants in London and Toronto, with background research in Taipei, indicated there were other divisions, for instance, those between those who grew up within the Cold War and those who grew up afterwards, the latter being more focused on Taiwanese identity as a transnational diasporic one than on one linked to a particular nation, leaving aside more general but still significant differences such as gender, professional status, class, city of birth, and city of residence, and so forth. All of these are likely to have a significant impact on international business. For instance, many European and North American companies use Taiwan as a stepping stone to mainland China, and thus expect their Taiwanese partners to be able to broker deals with mainland companies. However, this is likely to be more true for Wai Shengran than for Ban Shengran, and to be further complicated because not all the people who are technically considered as Wai Shengran were necessarily interested in maintaining ties to the mainland. So, the stereotypes exist, but one shouldn't place too much stock in them. Nonetheless, the IB literature largely treats Taiwan as an undifferentiated cultural unit, even when it comes to considering knowledge flows, human capital, performance, and social networking, all of which are likely to be influenced by the divisions discussed above. Other papers may note, for instance, that the rise of Taiwan's electronics sector was driven by investment from the US and Japan, but fail to consider that this was driven by Cold War politics and or colonial or diasporic ties with the two developed countries. The difficulties with using a dimension-driven approach are thus rather clearly outlined. However, as noted, there seems to be increasing acknowledgement of the limitations of such approaches. Several recent papers on mergers and acquisitions in top international business journals, while ostensibly based on dimensions of culture, universally conclude that a dimension-based approach alone is not enough to understand the activities and decisions of managers in such cases. Studies of multinational teams have likewise begun acknowledging that some element of subjective, contextualized research is necessary to understand how and why they succeed and fail. Movement towards more complex paradigms is thus not only possible, but is being acknowledged as necessary. Furthermore, the need for change has been even more strongly driven by practitioners who require a way of engaging with other cultures which acknowledges the complex reality rather than presenting a simplified tick box view. Anthropologists such as Genevieve Bell, in residence at the Intel Corporation, are influencing business practice, even if their role may not always be acknowledged in IB literature. It's interesting, if you Google her name, you're more likely to come up with articles in the business press than in the business journals. Anthropologists may be concerned with the idea of doing ethnography on organizations as loosely applied by managers with little understanding of how formal ethnography works. However, organizations such as the Ethnographic Praxis and Industry Conference exist to recognize the fact that the professional advantages of anthropology have not only been acknowledged in industry, but have been adopted by many companies. Static, rigid approaches to culture and activity, and their failure to actually relate to international business, are thus being rejected on the practitioner level. And the need for more flexible approaches has not gone acknowledged in academia. In a paper published this year in the Journal of World Business, Bird and Mendenhall note that a simple, bounded, national-level approach simply does not work in an era in which organizations of all sizes cross borders and operate globally as a matter of course. Take an organization like BMW. You know, everybody says it's a German company, but while you can undoubtedly say there's a German influence on the company, you know, can you really say it's totally German when its managers will have crossed the borders into the UK, into Portugal, the United States, China, and may be acquired from other companies, will engage in local partnerships, and so on and so forth. Although it has taken a decade, the impact of this critique is beginning to be more strongly felt, and there have been attempts to introduce more complexity, for instance through the Globe study, which, although dimension-based, at the very least increased the number and the nuance of the dimensions. And tellingly, at the last year's Academy of Management, its participants convened a panel to acknowledge and attempt to overcome their difficulties of dealing with issues such as gender. The need for new ways of looking at culture in international business has thus been recognized in more and more mainstream venues, and the initial critique of anthropologists, among others, is gradually changing the discourse on culture. The question, therefore, thus becomes, what anthropology can contribute beyond critiquing and supplying alternate perspectives on culture? What anthropology can contribute to IB, with its call for more transnationally focused, effective understandings of the role of culture and agency, is, as discussed in the introduction, to provide the same analysis of people who work in Deutsche Bank as it did of people who lived in mud huts, that is, to take an immersive, experiential gathering and analysis of data on the organization and, through participating in, observing, and sharing the lives of its members as much as possible, to introduce meaning into a discipline still dominated by function. Some examples can be seen in the research I conducted in and around BMW's mini automobile factory in Cowley, Oxford, from 2003 to 2006. The company's director allowed me to make observation on ethnic and national identities in exchange for conducting research on a topic of direct concern to them. They were having difficulties recruiting women and with retaining staff hired through temporary labor agencies. Their exit interviews were not providing conclusive results, suggesting the problem was something which could be best ascertained through ethnography, through having a trained researcher join the workers on the assembly line and analyze the experience. I have no idea who that is. The findings of the initial study were that the main barrier to recruiting women to work at the plant had to do with British native categories regarding women's work, particularly in areas traditionally the purview of the British working class. Native categories, to explain a concept which may not be familiar to everybody, refers to the way in people in a particular society or a group classify the world. This classification be wholly or partly unconscious and is usually tacit. As an example, many people in the UK would say, think of people from the United States as closer to them than, say, people from France, even though a simple look at a map or a globe will show that this isn't actually the case. And yet, for social reasons, our mental maps tend to work this way. In this case, although automotive plants are clean environments requiring workers in a variety of physical types, conversation with British academic colleagues and informants suggested that most people's image of the automotive industry is of hard, dirty work, unsuitable for women. When I spoke with colleagues at the university about what I was doing academically, the general reaction was surprise that, and I write a direct quote, a little woman would be capable of doing such a job. I'm 163 centimeters tall, which is average height for a woman in the UK, and have been known to bench press 45 kilograms. I don't think that that even particularly disqualifies me from working on the line. Similar discourses also prevailed among working class colleagues. One of the women with whom I took the entrance interview, whose accent placed her in the working class and whose previous jobs included 20 years at a printing plant, meaning she was familiar with factory work, said to me on seeing the other candidates, "We don't stand a chance among all these big, strong men." Having already talked with the directors, I knew that, as I said, they were looking not for big, strong men, but for little, nimble women. And so actually she had a slight advantage over me since she was smaller than me, but I didn't say anything at the time. Finally, recruiters also recognized this categorization of women in car factory work. I had registered with the temporary labour agency which staffed the final assembly area 12 months before the project started, seeking to obtain summer vacation employment. But I was never asked whether I would consider doing manual or unskilled labour, and the jobs which were recommended to me were generally of a clerical or secretarial type. I might also add that, given that this was Oxford and there are a lot of unemployed or semi-employed graduate students around the place, there was a lot of competition for the clerical jobs, and I never actually got any. And yet it never apparently occurred to the agency's staff to suggest, have you considered factory work? And also, perhaps not insignificantly, it never occurred to me to say to the recruiter, this isn't working, are there any jobs going in Cowley? So in the case of BMW Mini, the situation was further complicated in that German native categories regarding women in automobile factory work were significantly different. According to another anthropologist, John Bornemann, many of the modern German attitudes to gender and work were developed in the aftermath of World War II, when both East and West Germany had an unusually large number of female-headed households due to the effect of the war on the male population. And it was also influenced by post-war German ideals of egalitarianism on both sides of the wall. Consequently, although, as in the UK, German women do not tend to work in automobile factories, my informal survey of the BMW Regensburg plant compared to Cowley suggested that both of them had a population of about 10% women. Attitudes and behaviour I observed at BMW's Regensburg plant and among the German top management at Cowley Works reflect an idea that women should be able to work in factories and that a multi-gendered workforce is something to work towards. The problems the company was facing were in part due to the fact that the German native categories relating to female car factory workers were superficially similar to, but practically different than, British ones, which is where anthropology can come in. The fascinating thing is that when people from two different cultures say women's work or management or culture, they both think they're talking about the same thing, and they may even, when asked to give definitions, say the same words, but what they're thinking of and what their categories are very, very different. Some of you are probably wondering when these guys were going to turn up. The native category issue was, however, complicated by the fact that there was also an element of recontextualization involved. Recontextualization was defined by Marioko Brannan as, and I quote, how transferred organizational assets take on new meanings in distinct cultural contexts. Essentially, recontextualization is the phenomenon whereby taking a concept or practice across borders leads to either the practice or its meaning changing as semiotic meanings shift from culture to culture. Give an example, Brannan's study of Disney theme parks in Tokyo and Paris, based on anthropological analyses as well as her own experiences of living in Japan and France, developed the context of recontextualization to consider the question of why the Japanese theme park was more successful than the French one, which is very interesting actually, because if you stop any random student in a management studies class and say, why did Euro Disney initially fail while Tokyo Disney has just gone from strength to strength? And the first thing they'll say is, oh, well, Japan is culturally closer to the United States than France is. However, Hofstede's analysis of dimensions of culture puts France much closer to the US than Japan to the US. And if you consider another measure of cultural closeness, France is actually the single largest consumer of Disney products outside of the US. She argues that the sign becomes a signifier when placed in different contexts, not divorced from its original meaning, but different to it. So her point was that the cultural analyses don't work in this situation because the theme park is recontextualized differently in the Japanese context than to the French one. The Japanese quite like holidays with fantasy castles, and they like the cute aspects of Disney, the mice and the cuddly toys and so forth. Where the French tend to like the adventure aspect of Disney. They're by far the favorite character in French consumption of Disney is Donald Duck, who's a bit of an aggressive figure and certainly much more given to the kind of adventure narrative than to fairy tales and cute animals. So in the case of BMW Mini, the German attempts to introduce their own categories of gender and work. Wanted to improve gender diversity through making outreach programs to female school children and through determining how best to change attitudes on the line, failed. Not because they met with hostility on the part of the British workforce, but because they were recategorized in a way that diminished their relevance to local categories of gender and class. For instance, they generally tended to be considered as forms of corporate social responsibility or community engagement rather than diversity management. So the German managers tended to talk about gender as a diversity issue, but the people on the line tended to say, well, yeah, of course it's nice that they're trying to increase the number of women on the line, yeah, let's get on with things. Obviously they're being socially responsible. If it was considered at all, it was on the management level, reflecting the idea that factory work was unsuitable for women, but managerial jobs were not. Others recontextualized them by turning agency onto the workers. So 2 HR managers, when I was interviewing them severally about the shift system at the plant, talked about women with children choosing the night or weekend shifts deliberately so as to work around childcare responsibilities. But rather than thinking about what this said about women's ability to work at the plant and how easy it was for the plant culture to accommodate women, they talked about this as a lifestyle choice around the lines of working a second job. So looking at native categories and recontextualization in the case of BMW and how they affected attitudes to women working on the line, it casts some light on the way in which cross-border diversity management initiatives more generally can be particularly difficult to implement. Because, firstly, there may be a semiotic conflict between headquarters and local native categories of diversity. And second, because such initiatives may be subject to recontextualization, meaning the initiative can meet no local resistance and may even be regarded by local managers and workers as a good thing without it actually making a significant difference to workforce native categories or traditional practices. While the final report for this project circulated among top management and the managers of the temporary labour agencies, and while changes were made to the recruiting and training programs as a result, the impact on gender ratios within the plant is unknown. Moving away from the goals of the company and on to more general areas of academic interest, another contribution anthropology can make is it allows greater tolerance of ambivalence in research. A key issue overlooked within the social sciences, as identified by Smelser, Merton and others, and being developed by Alice Lamb, is that it assumes an inherent rationality in human behavior when in practice ambivalence and irrationality are often crucial drivers. However, ambivalence can be obscured by methods which concentrate on forced choice alternative or assume these to be reflexive of respondents' actual mental states, and analytical methods which presuppose that the objective truth can be determined from observing human behavior. Ethnographic methods, however, with their focus on the small scale and face-to-face, can allow the inclusion of such contradictions, ambivalence and irrationality, and furthermore, it has analytical methods which include the researcher's perspective among those of the respondents. One of the aspects of the BMW takeover of Mini, which was of keen interest to researchers as well as to its own managers, was its success. Rover, Mini's parent company, has become something of a symbol of the failure of British industry in the late 20th century. Not necessarily, not deserved so much, but it does tend to be true. And the British managers are generally stereotyped as hostile to German business success, a hostile which arguably goes back to the 19th century political and economic rivalry between the two nations, and exacerbated more recently by British narratives about World War II. I think it's kind of interesting that I'm giving this talk in the week that a remake of Dad's Army is opening in the theaters. My own earlier research on the German expatriates of the City of London seemed to indicate that a degree of hostility towards the Germans would be expected, if only because they were the newcomers acquiring the company, and as well as other phenomena such as an entire dealing room full of people celebrating the end of Friday by jumping up and chanting the theme tune from The Great Escape. A friendlier merger between Daimler and Chrysler had famously fallen apart despite predictions of success and compatibility between the corporate cultures. However, instead BMW Mini, which seemed a less perfect match in corporate culture terms, particularly when you consider that this is a luxury car company taking over what's effectively a cheap car company, became an ongoing success, leading to the question of how they had overcome the potential for such hostility and conflict. What I found while studying the British managers of BMW was that in fact they had not overcome hostility. Rather, hostility towards the plant's takeover was mixed with relief that the company would continue in some form, pride at the Mini's success and at their association with a global prestige brand, and with more nebulous feelings about the factory within the local community. Having been established in 1912 by the future Lord Nuffield, multiple generations of managers and labourers in the Oxford area had worked there, and it was seen as a kind of local asset, with the general sentiment being that in the end, who owned it was less important than it continues to exist. What's particularly interesting is that this generally didn't tend to come up explicitly, or even, I suspect, consciously within the way the managers talked about it. They'd they'd say this is great, this is wonderful, this is fantastic, and then they would, in the next breath, say the trouble with the management. And so they were just flip-flop, flip-flop. There's a wonderful excerpt I frequently quote in more focused papers in which the sentences begin, it's not the problem with the Germans, it is a German thing, it's not a problem with the Germans, it is a German thing, and so on for about a paragraph, just to illustrate the ambivalence. Furthermore, other sorts of ambivalence were present in the organization. The workers, for instance, were not particularly motivated by pride in the product. And I can tell you that when you're when you have a minute and a half to descend upon a car, hook it up to an electrical system, press a set of plastic screws into the top of the bonnet, press an indicator light into the socket for the indicator light correctly, not breaking it, jump into the car, slam the steering cowl cover onto the steering column, and then click through a series of menu items testing the electrical system of the car before leaping out, grabbing the electrical leads and rushing onto the next car to complete all this in another 90 seconds, you really begin to hate Minis. My perspective changed entirely in 3 months from walking past Minis, parked Minis in the street and going, oh, it's a Mini, how cool, to, oh my God, he's plumped for the deluxe assortment with the seat-back television in the rear. Doesn't he know that adds an extra 30 seconds onto the electrical test, and I would never get that done in time. I hate you, I hate you. So yeah, ambivalence. Most of the people on the line, apart from myself, were working in it for, as they put it, good wages and good mates, a means to an end rather than something to value in and of itself. But despite this, they also clearly cared about the factory in rather less instrumental ways. For instance, one woman told me about how her father had worked on the assembly line where she now worked, and another very proudly introduced me to her son, who was also working on the line further down another area. Interestingly, the one prior owner who came in for universal criticism within the workforce was a British owner who was seen as having tried to asset strip the plant, which was seen as no-go. So the workers had an ambivalent tension between their explicit narrative that the factory was a place to go for money and to make friends, and the product was a nuisance and all this, and their more tacit association of the factory with family and local tradition. This ambivalence, furthermore, was not immediately apparent. It was discerned by immersing myself in the plant's culture, listening to the various ways managers and workers talked about the plant's history, owners, and success, and also through the fact that I was living in Cowley at the time and was able to develop insights into the local culture. The acquisition's success was therefore not down to cultural compatibility or attempts to overcome conflict or even organizational identity, so much as a willingness of people to put up with aspects of the situation they didn't like. So looking at examples from the BMW study thus indicates the ways in which the anthropology can contribute to a study of cultural factors in multinational and transnational operations. In the first place, it contributes a meaning-based perspective as discussed above. Rather than attempting to render people's behavior into some kind of ideal form, which may not or may not exist, and may exist only in rare cases, anthropologists are able to generate data from the ambivalences, errors, and deviations between ideal and reality which genuinely happen in organizations in real life. A study of gender on the factory floor at BMW might conclude that, since British and German workers had much the same gender proportions, that both cultures had the same gender-native categories as far as women and work goes. It's only by considering the construction of gender and work in both countries, and considering the wider social context, that a key reason behind the failure of the drive to recruit more women in the mini plant became clear. Which brings me on to another point, the potential for holistic approaches. Where IB studies tend to focus on managers, and labor studies tend to focus on workers, with the other category appearing as a vague, benign, or antagonistic background figure in either case, neither presents the whole story of the organization. Anthropology presents the opportunity to compare and contrast multiple perspectives in the organization. It's also worth noting that the Cowley work study drew on historical sources, earlier studies, oral histories, memoirs, and company data. Taking a holistic and multidisciplinary approach might also have helped the IB studies in Taiwan, critiqued above, develop a more usable perspective. This leads to the final point, the methodological aspect of anthropology. An ethnographic approach means that, rather than relying only on interviews, surveys, and other data, the researcher's lived experience becomes part of the study, including experiences that don't necessarily fall within the official scope of fieldwork, such as having been registered with a temporary labor agency and failing to get a job, or living in the same area as many of the workers and experiencing the same social conditions. The researcher's relationship to the people they interview can also be analyzed. The aim of such fieldwork is also less to generalize than to compare, to develop insights into the organizations and into cultures by comparing and contrasting them with others. This is implicit in that the researcher will inherently be comparing the data to their own experiences elsewhere, and then, during the analysis phase, can lead to other comparisons to different work, to historical data, and to other ethnographies. Anthropology can thus reveal negative and ambivalent and tacit aspects of business, and can also allow the use of the researcher themselves as an instrument. This particular leads on to the final key aspect which anthropology can lend to the study of culture in the context of globalization, which is rather less accepted within IB and other management-related studies at present. This is the practice of reflexivity, or critical reflection on the researcher's own participation in the study process. As part of ethnographic research, the ethnographer is expected to be aware of their own presence, reflect on its impact, and to take into account the role, positive and negative, which their personal characteristics might have played in the study. Being young, female, and white in a car factory, for instance, gives different insights than being middle-aged, male, and black, and the researcher's perspective needs to be taken into account when interpreting their research, not as a limitation to be factored out of the conclusions. Your perspective does not include all perspectives in the factory, therefore you can't claim it as scientific, but as a source of data to be embraced as used. This is an account of factory work from somebody who is young, female, and white. What does it tell us about factory work? How might it compare to other people's perspectives, and what might that tell us? Furthermore, the assumption that an interviewee's words can be taken as a factual, objective account of their work, feelings, and history within the organization must also be questioned. Interview subjects can be at best ambivalent and often may have radically divergent accounts of the organization, something which anthropologists have called the Rashomon effect, hence the picture which illustrates this slide, referring to the celebrated film by Akira Kurosawa, in which each of the four protagonists tells a completely different story about the same events. Reflecting on the participants of the study, including the researcher, makes it harder to assume objectivity, either from oneself or from one's interview subjects. Someday I'm going to write a paper about some of the emotional and relationship complexities of doing research in a factory organization, but I'm waiting for a few more people to retire first and possibly change my name. This concept is also related to that of native categories, in that the implication is that the researcher themselves has their own native categories through which they filter the data they analyze. And equally, as Buckley and Chapman noted in an article on native categories of business, that research on business does not take place in a vacuum, but these native categories are formed and developed through researchers publishing their material and practitioners in turn reading their publications, either first-hand or through textbooks and popular management works. For a somewhat pointed development, I recommend the article "Thumbs Up is a Rude Gesture in Australia," which examines the frequently outrageous errors which are reproduced in accounts of culture in international business textbooks, such as the one involving thumbs up in Australia, concluding more seriously that the implicit purpose of the textbooks is not to engage sympathetically with actual cultural differences, but rather to mold the next generation of American managers into a common pattern by identifying an exotic cultural other against which students will form their new identity. So the truth or falsity of statements about culture is less important than what it says about how we define ourselves. As Tsui recently noted, the current focus on quantitative methods and measures of distance can lead to the illusion of objectivity, and the idea that such research exists in a conceptual vacuum, ignoring the mutual dependence between science and society. Do dimensions of culture exist because we expect them to exist? The notion of reflexivity also raises, on the other side, a key issue which has been frequently noted in the anthropology of business, the extent to which a genuinely immersive experience is possible in such an environment. I said I was going to come back to this. Traditionally, anthropologists are supposed to live with the people they study, share their lives as much as possible, and absorb the culture in order to understand it. Since business anthropologists study a workplace where people spend only a portion of their time, this is surely impossible, and furthermore, even being able to take a job with the organization is relatively rare, being mostly limited to unskilled jobs like the first part of my study at BMW. One can also note the preponderance of other ethnographic studies of unskilled manual work, such as Laurie Graham's at Subaru Isuzu or Delbridge on the line in Wales. Studies of office work, such as Raleine's, have often been people employed as trainees. Certainly it is rather more difficult to temporarily take a job as a manager, though not impossible, obviously. However, it is worth noting that, first of all, that not so many traditional anthropologists actually manage such an immersive experience. As Barley described, they frequently live outside the village, may not be able to master the language to such a degree that they can operate without a translator, and even when they can, may be subtly excluded from the mainstream perspective. Laura Bohannon, Charles Briggs, Jean Briggs, and others have observed that anthropologists frequently wind up drawn to marginal or atypical members of society. In fact, it is arguable that it is easier for anthropologists of business to find an acceptable role within the company. One of the differences between my study of German banks and the study of BMW is that BMW, as a research and development heavy company, was used to the presence of researchers from local universities, and I found myself assimilated within that social role. There's an anthropological joke which runs, "What is the traditional structure of the Inuit family?" And the response is mother, father, 2 to 5 children, 1 to 2 parents, and an anthropologist. After working at BMW for a while, I had a joke that what is the typical structure of a work unit at BMW, which the response is head of department, senior management, junior management, research team, and researcher from Oxford University. Occasionally Oxford Brookes. So one of the differences between BMW was used to the presence of the researchers from local universities, and I found myself assimilated within that social role, whereas the banks, which did not do that sort of intensive research, tended instead to treat me as a consultant or a journalist, both social roles in which people may be frequently visiting the bank and interviewing its staff, but which are going to influence how people react to you, what they tell you, the sort of impression they're trying to make of you, Everything from whether when you go into the institution you're ushered into a meeting room and given a china teacup with the best tea, to whether you're ushered into the room with the drawing boards and told to where the mugs are. So a reflexive perspective allows for an understanding of the researcher's role in organizations, regardless of the type of research the researcher is doing. Moreover, ethnographic techniques and reflexivity are not necessarily limited to the academy. Although, as noted above, some traditional anthropologists challenge such approaches, I've also been involved with a consultancy project, the aim of which was to teach ethnographic techniques to a team of international managers and coach them as they analyze their own organization reflexivity and considered its norms and values beyond simple statements of mission and vision. Is the customer really our king, you know? Is our product really our strongest asset? Other researchers have done similar work with international teams. Both Peterson et al. And Shippers et al. Have indicated that reflexivity, whether deliberately learned or whether emerging from the social environment, can have a moderating effect on conflict and misunderstandings in culturally diverse teams. Consequently, I would argue that they are not excluded from international business studies of a less immersive nature either, than in the case of any study. Reflection on the role of the researcher and of the subjects and of what may be influencing the accounts presented will improve the value of the work. Another area in which the existing status quo on the subject of culture and how to interpret it in international business has to do with the expansion of the discipline beyond North America, Western Europe, and Japan. While these, and particularly North America, remain a dominant influence, there are increasing numbers of studies of African and South American countries, India, China, and Eastern Europe, as these countries increase in power and influence and as more North American and other firms expand abroad. While at the moment the majority of such papers appear to reflect the dominant paradigms within IB, Henrik et al. Suggests that perspectives from the developing world may be emerging as a challenge to this, that North Americans may assume that because words such as management and culture are being used from people outside their countries, these words designate equivalent concepts when in fact they may well have been recontextualized. And we may find our concepts of management and culture and the discipline as a whole shifting as power in the wider business world shifts to different countries. A final methodological point which anthropology has to offer is that of alternative methods of assessing value to the usual norm in IB studies. One barrier to the wider adoption not just of anthropological methods but of qualitative methods more generally is that the focus tends to be on the generalizability of results, which consequently tends to favor larger quantitative samples and methods less open to discussion of versions of diverse realities. However, although anthropology has been interested in generalizing results in the past, current anthropological comparison tends to seek a balance between the search for similarity and contrast and to situate human activity in its context. So while it is possible to say, for instance, that all human societies have religion or kinship systems, the differences in the way these universals are expressed are such that the analytical value lies more in considering the patterns of similarity and difference in how these ideas are expressed and developed. The comparative method, furthermore, makes the subjectivity of the ethnographic method into a strength rather than a weakness, as the ethnographer analyzes through comparison and as different versions within the account are compared and contrasted. Rather than focusing on generalizing about, for instance, expatriate adjustment, value can be gained from analyzing the accounts of expatriates and considering what lessons can be learned from them and where and when these lessons are most applicable. In terms of what anthropology contributes to the study of companies in globalization, then, I would argue that not only has it already developed our understanding of the actual role of culture and the social processes which operate across borders, but that the discipline itself has more to contribute. This further contribution, however, has less to do with anthropology itself as a tool for studying organizations and more to do with what lessons other disciplines involved in the study of international business can take from it, to become less objective, more reflexive, less focused on a single methodology and more a bricoleur, in the words of classic structuralist Levi-Strauss, adopting different methods and sources of data across a variety of disciplines, and less exclusive, more inclusive, as practitioners and their perspectives on the organization can be brought in not just as subjects, but as co-researchers, and as the academic role in the development of business cultures can be not only acknowledged and understood, but used as part of the study of transnational organizations. So a few concluding thoughts on this matter. In 2014, the late Alan Rugman, head of the Said Business School during my period of residency there, created controversy at the Academy of International Business annual meeting by announcing in his keynote address that culture did not matter to international business studies. Seen from an anthropological perspective, I would argue that Rugman was right, that culture, constructed in terms of behaviour and function, is of increasing little use not just to practitioners but to researchers. The fact that the traditional view is being challenged not just via anthropology or the critical movement within IB itself, but also from the activity of practitioners seeking complex engagement with cultures on a level congruent with their needs, suggests that the ways in which researchers in IB relate to, measure, and define culture are finally undergoing a necessary shift from function to meaning, from a predominantly functionalist one to one which allows more acknowledgement of interpretation ambivalence, from one which presumes a distance between researcher and subject to one that presupposes that we are all dwellers in mud huts. In the future, the focus must shift to the reflexive consideration of the role of researcher, subject, and consumer and the interdependency between them to develop our understanding of how organizations genuinely operate in the world of international business, which is every bit as ambivalent, complex, and subjectively interpreted as any other. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Fiona. Before we have the vote of thanks, time for a small number of questions. Here first.
One characterises Germans as having a very organised, rigid and hierarchical society, and yet within Deutsche Bank you think there's nothing German about it. It's a very disorganised organisation. Have you got something there?
Yeah. And this, in fact, gets into issues of subjectivity and native categories. One of the things that came out of the study of German banks was I would sit down and I would ask people, how do you define German culture? And the same things would come up over and over. They're organized, they're efficient, Ordnung muss sein, das weiß man schon von klein, and so on and so forth. But the interesting thing was that what I was observing was not congruent with that. And so I started mixing this up. I started saying in interviews, well, Sven's not very organized. Oh, he's an exception. Well, you were half an hour late this morning. Oh, well, the tube, you can't expect to be on time in London. Or, but I would say, but Deutsche Bank itself is not really a very organized institution. Oh, yes, well, we're trying to be transnational and American and, ever since we absorbed, that sort of thing. So there were more exceptions than rules. And yet, everybody had the same perception. So this is partly what stimulated my thoughts on native categories, because there was, on the one hand, the reality, and yet on the other hand, the category, that people did not, the Germans may not have been organized, but people assumed they were, and also behaved as if they were, and treated every German who was not organized as an exception, without bothering to sit down and count whether there were more exceptions than rules.
There's a question at the back there.
I've always found Deutsche Bank, having worked internationally, very generous with their attitudes to various things, particularly towards their art, which I wonder then if the sort of thing that you're doing, is it Deutsche Bank's idea that they want to get under the skin of our culture? Were they pleased with what you did for them?
Well, my relationship with Deutsche Bank is a little interesting. The primary focus of the study of the expatriates was not actually Deutsche Bank, but DZ Bank. Deutsche Bank came in secondarily, interestingly, through social connections and in a slightly strange way. I was introduced to a German culture specialist, and picture typical desperate graduate student running after, please, do you know anybody I could talk to in German business? And he just sort of throws a name, at me and gives me an email address and goes on his busy way. So I emailed this person, had a very nice conversation, set up an interview, went to Frankfurt. The friend who I normally stayed with in Frankfurt drove me to pick me up at the airport, says, okay, who are you interviewing? And I told her the name and she swallowed her teeth. It was the CEO. So Deutsche Bank were actually not official participants in the study, but through him and through his connections, I was able to get access to Deutsche Bank. So Deutsche Bank did not, in fact, they did not receive a copy of my final report. They didn't ask for one. They didn't particularly want one. It was just kind of one manager sort of thought my project was interesting, and so introduced me to his connections. So. Did Deutsche Bank benefit? Well, I hope some of them have read the research and have benefited from it. As to their stake in it, as I said, it was very much kind of arbitrary. And you talk about the art collection. A lot of that is also very much influenced by the tastes of whichever manager is curating it that year. So, in a sense, I was sort of an art project for them, but. A bit of perhaps more general, loosely defined benefit than setting up an exhibition.
Thank you.
One question here, I think then we'll probably have to move on. Yeah.
As you said, Cowley is a long-established plant with families working there for generations. Did you look at BMW's other purchase, Rolls-Royce, which is on a greenfield site? Do any comparisons between the two?
I would have loved to, but I didn't get the chance. When I approached the BMW managers saying, I'd like to expand my study out and I'd like to look at other plants in the group, they gave me connections with Regensburg. But I think some of that was how the plant worked. I mean, if you're familiar with Cowley Works, you'll know that the plants in the group tend to be twinned. And the reason why they all had the Regensburg contacts was they were twinned with Regensburg. So it kind of developed from there. Again, considered within the context of subjective perspectives, this is what you get. I like following what happens to the BMW group in the literature and also in the media as well. So one of the ethnographic wider ethnographic influences on the study was actually engendered by joining Rover owners clubs. And looking at the perception of the Rover brand and the Rover cars and how people resolve their ambivalence towards modern Minis and Rolls Royce. And still in a Facebook group, for one, somebody put up a picture of the new Land Rover and, sort of humorously, next is a publicity picture of a new Land Rover next to an old Land Rover, and somebody humorously captioned it, "You're adopted." So, that sort of thing is interesting to consider.
Okay, there's going to be time for refreshments afterwards for you to ask other questions of Fiona. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move us to the vote of thanks. So Professor Brendan McSweeney is going to come and do that.
Dean, distinguished guests, colleagues, students, and very pleased the opportunity to pose a vote of thanks. Professor Moore's lecture, I'm sure you agree, was extremely erudite, deeply immersed in literature, and we also had very numerous stories about our ethnographic work. And that was news to me. I teach a course called Manly Cross Borders with Fiona, but as also appeared in her lecture now, I'm no longer just be asking her about the literature or complaining about the tiny handful of students that persist in reproducing these simplified models, despite our best efforts to prevent them doing so. I will now be asking her help in helping to repair my car. So, I want to speak briefly, just a few comments on the notion of anthropology's role in critique of simplified models of culture. And these models have huge impact. Just before I came to the lecture, I checked on Google Scholar, and you may recall, those of you who are familiar, that Professor Moore mentioned Geert Hofstede, who was one of perhaps the main proponent of the kind of simplified models. And looking at the Field's publication, I see it's 60,000 citations. And I guess the popularity model is not so difficult to explain, given the immense complexity of the world. How you package a product, how you manage a multinational team, where you locate your research, it's understandable, albeit foolish, that a simplified model that explains that this country is like this and this country is like that is extremely helpful. But I think more deeply, the simplified model draws on a more widespread and deeper view of stereotyping of people in countries. Irish people are charming, of course, all English people are usually correct, and other kinds of. And that sort of nonsense, in some sense, doesn't simply on sections of management. And also given history here, for example, I recall reading A.J. Taylor's statement that the Paul Hitler was that he was a German. Now, two thoughts with that. First of all, Hitler was actually an Austrian, but more importantly was the idea that it could just easily be Fritz, or since I don't mean the gender could have been Ava. And similarly even here, about Holloway was occasional in politics and international relations. We have the work of Samuel B. Huntington, who also draws on a simplified model. Unlike Costello, Trump and ours, he divides the world into so-called civilizations and makes these nonsensical generalizations, and yet these things have huge influence. Now, Professor Moore kindly mentioned my work, and I and other people have, over time, kind of bombarded these simplified models, and yet you don't seem to have had a huge impact. And I think if we draw a military analogy here, that if you look at the Iraq War, that you might win the military campaign, but you've got to win the hearts and minds. And one of the consequences of excluding the Sunnis from it is we've had the rise of ISIS. And I think the general consensus that they simply can't be defeated by aerial attack. And my colleagues and I have such been imposing a kind of blitzkrieg or aerial attack in Australia, and it's not working. We may have damaged the enemy, but we haven't had sufficient impact. So there's a need for a new approach, and I think it's the new approach that Professor Moore and others are developing. That's what it is. My father was in the army during the war, and he joined the artillery. He told this is to keep as far away from the battlefield as possible. And I guess I'm doing that. But we need infantry and tanks now. And in the school as a whole, we've got Just Gamble and Chris Smith as well, and others really some more detailed work. But I'm going to continue following my father's advice and stay back in the army. So let me just conclude with a quotation from another anthropologist, Adam Cooper, who observes, unless we separate out the various processes that are lumped together under the heading of culture and then look beyond the field of culture to other processes, we will not get very far in understanding any of it. And this is what Professor Moore and colleagues, Professor Moore, are doing. And we thank her for her past contributions, and we look forward with great enthusiasm to her future contributions. So I'd ask you to join me in acknowledging our excellent lecture this evening once again.
Thank you, Brendan, Professor Swing. Thank you, Fiona, Professor Moore. There are some refreshments outside. Please do join us. Thank you.